Good day. How you doing? So it's Black History Month. The month of February is Black History Month. So I thought we'd read a story called The Story of Ruby Bridges. And it's by Robert Coles, illustrated by George Ford. And that little girl is Sweet Ruby Bridges. And boy, was she a brave little girl. Now, we talked about her a little bit, but we'll read about her in this book. Ruby was a smart, very brave little girl. Okay, and here she is, sweet little Ruby Bridges. Isn't she cute? Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylerton, Mississippi. We were very poor. Very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. Okay, so they were very poor. Can you imagine being so poor that you don't have enough food to eat? So her daddy had to go find another job. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. That's good. He found a new job. Her mother took care of their children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. So poor her mommy had to go to work after the kids went to sleep. That's a hard-working person. Very hard. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. There she is. They're trying to change the laws. And there they are in church. Ruby's parents were very proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through this trouble and Ruby would be a good girl and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed, and we prayed long and we prayed hard. Okay? Because they know this is not going to be easy. Because the white people in Louisiana did not want the black children to go to school with their children. Isn't that terrible? And here's little Ruby going to school. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns. Can you imagine this poor little girl having to go to school and being protected by men with guns because the people were that angry that they didn't want a black child to go to school with their children? That's just sad. Poor little Ruby. And there she is, and there's the marshals that are there to protect her. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the Frantz school surrounded by marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. How could they treat that little girl like that? Those are some awful people. It makes me very sad. And there's sweet little Ruby in her classroom all by herself because the white parents wouldn't send their kids to school because a sweet little black girl was in that classroom. Isn't that terrible? All because of the color of her skin. And we know the color of our skin doesn't make us a different person. We're all the same inside. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, or to eat lunch with. But every day Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom, an empty building. Can you imagine how boring that must have been for poor Ruby? But her teacher was really nice, because we know teachers are really nice. There she is with Mrs. Henry. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep being relaxed or hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. I think a lot of children would get very frightened by that and say, "Mommy, I don't want to go to the school anymore. I'm afraid." But she didn't. Then one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. I wonder what she was doing. There she is, looking at all the people who are so angry at her. What do you think she's doing? What do you think she's saying to them? Would you say something to them? Would you be brave enough to say something to them? Let's find out what she was doing. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. I wonder what she was doing. Oh, she looks a little worried. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching, and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." That sweet child was saying a prayer for those people. Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. She wasn't angry at them. She was praying for them. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." That's the prayer she said every morning and every day on the way home from school. She wasn't angry at those people. She was praying for them. What a strong, sweet little girl. And there she is. And Ruby is still alive today. And she's still an activist. And she's still helping the world to become a better place. So think about that. When you're afraid of something, think about how brave Ruby was. And see if you can be as brave as she is.